Hello everyone. In section 1, we will discuss the iOS security model. You can imagine that there are lots of nasty attacks out there awaiting iOS devices. And in this section, we will break down how the iOS device is engineered to withstand and to deal with those types of attacks. First of all, we will start with the first feature of reduced attack surface. So an attack surface is the code that processes an input supplied by an attacker or a hacker. So if an Apple device has, or if Apple has vulnerability in their code, they choose not to ship it to iOS devices. It means that the attacker cannot exploit these devices. Therefore, a key practice is to minimize the amount of code an attacker can access to especially Hello everyone, in this section we will discuss the iOS security model. You can imagine that there are lots of attacks out there awaiting iOS devices. In this section we will discuss how iPhone mainly and iOS are engineered to withstand these types of attacks. First of all, we will start with the reduced attack surface of iOS devices. So as you know that the attack surface is the code that processes an attacker supplied input. So if Apple in general has a vulnerability in some of its code and they don't ship it to iOS devices, it means that an attacker cannot exploit this vulnerability. So a key practice actually is to minimize the amount of code an attacker have or can access. In general, Apple reduced the attack surface of iOS devices compared to Mac OS X devices or MacBook. In general, Java and Flash are not available in iOS. I know that Flash is deprecated, but again, Java is not available as well on iOS devices. These two applications have a bad history of security vulnerabilities, and not including them makes it harder for an attacker to find. So these are just an examples. Many other technologies are available on Mac OS and not available on the iOS. Likewise, certain types of files can be processed on Mac and cannot be processed on the iOS. For example, PSD files. This file type is mainly handled happily by Safari, but not by mobile Safari. Likewise, one of Apple's own formats, .mov for QuickTime, is partially supported on the iOS, and many MOV files that play on the Mac OS X won't play actually on the iOS devices. Finally, even though iOS renders PDF files natively, only some features of the PDF files are parsed by iOS. So as you can see, the attack surface or the amount of code that can run on iOS is much more stripped down. The second feature is the stripped down iOS. So beyond just reducing the potential code an attacker might exploit, Apple also stripped down the number of useful applications an attacker might want to use during or after exploitation. So the most obvious example is that there is no shell on an iOS device. So there is no bash or shell. In Mac OS X exploits, the main goal is to try to execute a shell in a shellcode. Because there is no shell at all in iOS, some other end goals might be developed for iOS exploits. So another security feature. Privilege separation. So iOS separates processes using users, groups, and other traditional Unix file permission mechanism. You might be familiar with Mac and DAC access control. This is the same concept applied on iOS devices. For example, many of the applications to which the user has direct access, such as the web browser, the mail, etc., run under a user called mobile. The most important system processes run under the privileged user named root. So other system processes run as other users, such as wireless or MD&S responder, etc. But in general, using this model, an attacker who gets full control of a process, such as the web browser, as we just mentioned, will be constrained by the fact that the code he or she is executing will be running as a user mobile. So again, a very important feature of privilege separation. Code signing, one of the most important security mechanisms in iOS is code signing. All the binaries and libraries must be signed by a trusted authority such as Apple before the kernel will allow them to be executed. Furthermore, only pages in the memory that come from signed sources will be executed. So this means that applications cannot change their behavior dynamically or upgrade themselves. Talking about DEP, or data execution prevention, normally it's a mechanism whereas a processor can distinguish which portion of memory are executable code and which portions of the memory are data. So DEP feature will not allow the execution of data, it will only allow the execution of code. ASLR, or address space layout randomization. So as discussed earlier, the way attackers try to bypass DEP, data execution prevention, is to reuse existing code snippets. However, to do this, they need to know where the code segments they want to reuse are located. So ASLR makes this difficult to them by randomizing the location of the objects in memory, which makes it impossible for them to execute code. Sandboxing, which is somehow the final piece of the iOS defense, allows even finer grained control over the actions that processes can perform than Unix permission system mentioned earlier. So for example, both the SMS application and the web browser run as a user mobile, as we discussed, but perform very different actions. The SMS application probably doesn't need access to your web browser cookies, and the web browser doesn't need access to your text messages. So third-party applications from the App Store shouldn't have access to either of these things. Sandboxing solves this problem by allowing Apple to specify exactly what permissions are necessary for each application.